A man lies in his tent on a cold Anatolian night in the year 1280. He is not yet 30 years old, but he has already seen more war than most men see in a lifetime. His name is Osman. Outside, his small tribe sleeps uneasily on the frontier between the Islamic world and the crumbling Byzantine Empire. Behind him, a world in chaos. The Mongols have destroyed the old order. The Seljuk Empire is collapsing. Dozens of Turkish tribes fight for survival in the mountains and valleys of Anatolia. Before him, uncertainty. Will his tribe survive another year? Will the Byzantines crush them? Will a rival Beylik absorb them? Will the Mongols return to finish what they started? But tonight, something changes. Tonight, Osman closes his eyes and sees a vision that will alter the course of history. A dream so powerful, so clear, so prophetic that it will be remembered 600 years later. He sees a moon rise from the chest of his teacher, the holy man Edebali, and enter his own chest. He sees a tree grow from his body, its roots spreading deep into the earth, its branches reaching toward the sky. The tree grows and grows until it covers the entire world. The mountains of the Caucasus, the Atlas, the Taurus, all beneath its shade. 4 great rivers flow from its roots: the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, the Danube. Fields of wheat surround it. Forests bow before it. Cities rise in its shadow. The leaves of the tree are swords, gleaming in the sunlight. Crowns hang from its branches like fruit. And on Osman's finger, a ring, and from that ring a light that points like an arrow toward Constantinople, the greatest city in the world. Osman wakes with his heart pounding. He is covered in sweat despite the cold. He knows with absolute certainty that this was not just a dream. This was a message. This was prophecy. This was destiny calling. He does not yet know that this dream will inspire a dynasty that will rule for 6 centuries. He does not yet know that his descendants will conquer Constantinople, will rule 3 continents, will build an empire that stretches from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean. But he knows, in that moment, that his life has a purpose greater than mere survival. He knows that he is meant to build something that will outlast him. He knows that he has been chosen. This is the story of how that dream became reality. This is the story of Osman, founder of the Ottoman dynasty. This is not the story of the empire at its height, not the tale of conquered Constantinople or glittering palaces. This is the story of the beginning, when everything was uncertain, when survival was not guaranteed, when one man's vision was all that stood between a small tribe and oblivion. This is the story of how empires are truly born. Not in moments of glory, but in years of struggle. Not through single victories, but through vision, patience, determination, and faith. 6 hours. 1 man. 1 dream. 1 dynasty that changed the world. But to understand how Osman came to have this dream, to understand how a tribal leader became a dynasty founder, we must go back further. We must go back to the world that shaped him, the chaos that created the opportunity, the forces that pushed Turkish tribes westward into Anatolia. We must understand the world of the mid-13th century, a world being torn apart and remade by forces beyond any one man's control. The year 1258 was a catastrophe for the Islamic world. The Mongols, those terrifying horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia, had already conquered half the known world. They had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire. They had devastated Persia. They had crushed every army sent against them. And in 1258, they did the unthinkable. They took Baghdad. Baghdad, the city of the caliphs, the center of Islamic civilization for 500 years, the city of learning and culture and power. The Mongol general Hulagu Khan besieged the city, and when it fell, his soldiers did what Mongol soldiers always did. They destroyed. The great libraries were burned. Books that had survived for centuries were thrown into the Tigris River, so many that the river ran black with ink. Scholars were killed. The Abbasid Caliph, the spiritual leader of the Sunni Islamic world, was executed. The population was massacred. Estimates vary, but perhaps 200,000 people died in that week of slaughter. The psychological impact on the Islamic world was beyond measure. The caliphate, which had existed since the death of the Prophet Muhammad, was gone. The center of Islamic civilization had fallen to infidels who worshipped strange gods and showed no respect for the traditions that Muslims held sacred. It seemed like the end of the world. And for many, it was. The shockwaves spread across the Islamic world. If Baghdad could fall, what was safe? If the caliph could be killed, who was protected? The old certainties were gone. The old order was dead. A new age had begun, and no one knew what it would bring. In Anatolia, the impact was equally devastating but took a different form. Anatolia, the great peninsula that juts westward from Asia toward Europe, had been controlled by the Seljuk Turks for nearly 200 years. The Great Seljuk Empire had once stretched from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. But by the mid-13th century, the Seljuks of Anatolia, known as the Sultanate of Rum, were already weakening. Internal conflicts, succession disputes, economic problems, pressure from the Byzantines in the west and the Mongols in the east. And then in 1243, the Mongols invaded Anatolia. At the Battle of Kusay Dag, they crushed the Seljuk army. The Sultanate survived, but only as a Mongol vassal. The real power now lay with the Mongol Ilkhanate based in Persia. This created a power vacuum. The Seljuk sultans were puppets. The Mongol Ilkhans were distant overlords who demanded tribute but did not directly govern. And into this vacuum poured the Turkish tribes. For centuries, Turkish nomads had been migrating westward from Central Asia, pushed by population pressure, pulled by opportunities for land and plunder. Some came as conquerors. Some came as mercenaries. Some came as refugees fleeing the Mongols. By the late 13th century, Anatolia was full of these Turkish tribes, each led by a bey, a chief, each controlling a small territory, each trying to expand at the expense of their neighbors or of the weakening Byzantine Empire to the west. These small principalities were called beyliks. There were dozens of them scattered across Anatolia. Some in the interior, some on the coast, some on the frontier between the Islamic and Christian worlds. Most were small, weak, constantly fighting each other for resources and territory. Most would disappear within a generation, absorbed by stronger neighbors or destroyed by the Mongols or simply fragmenting from internal conflicts. But a few would grow strong. A few would carve out lasting territories. And one, the smallest and least significant in 1280, would eventually swallow all the others and create an empire. That beylik was led by Ertugrul, and his son was named Osman. Ertugrul was the leader of the Kai tribe, part of the Great Oghuz Turkish Confederation. Where exactly he came from is disputed by historians. The later Ottoman chronicles, written centuries after the fact to glorify the dynasty's origins, tell elaborate stories of Ertugrul's exploits, his service to the Seljuk Sultan, his rewards of land on the Byzantine frontier. But contemporary sources are silent about Ertugrul. He was too minor a figure to merit mention in the chronicles of the time. What we know with some certainty is this: by the 1260s or 1270s, Ertugrul controlled a small territory in northwestern Anatolia, in the region of Bithynia, right on the frontier with the Byzantine Empire. His lands were centered around the town of Soud, a small settlement in a mountainous region. It was not rich land. It was not strategically vital. It was frontier land, dangerous land, where Byzantine raids could strike at any time, where survival required constant vigilance. But frontier land had advantages for an ambitious man. On the frontier, the old rules did not fully apply. A man could rise through prowess and courage rather than just birth. On the frontier, there were always opportunities for plunder and expansion at the expense of the Christians. On the frontier, warriors gathered, men seeking adventure and wealth, men fleeing justice elsewhere, men who wanted to fight for the faith. These were the Ghazis, the frontier warriors, men who saw themselves as fighting a holy war against the infidels. They were rough men, often brutal, but they were also bound by a code of honor and religious duty. They were the raw material from which empires could be built, if you had the vision and the skill to organize them. Into this world, sometime around 1258, though the exact date is unknown, a son was born to Ertugrul. His name was Osman, possibly named after Uthman ibn Affan, the third caliph of Islam. We know almost nothing about Osman's childhood. The sources are silent. Later Ottoman historians filled in the gaps with stories that may or may not be true, tales of young Osman's bravery in hunting, his skill with weapons, his wisdom beyond his years. But these are legends, not history. What we can say with confidence is this: Osman grew up in a world of constant warfare. He learned to ride almost before he could walk. He learned to use a bow, a sword, a lance. He learned to track enemies through the mountains. He learned when to fight and when to flee. He learned that survival on the frontier required both courage and cunning. He also learned about leadership. His father Ertugrul was not just a warrior but a chief, responsible for his entire tribe. He had to settle disputes between his followers. He had to decide when to raid and when to negotiate. He had to manage relations with the Seljuk overlords, with the Mongol tax collectors, with neighboring beyliks, with Byzantine border commanders. He had to balance the desire of his warriors for plunder against the need to maintain his small territory. These were complex skills, and Osman learned them by watching his father. He learned that a leader must be brave, yes, but also wise. That a leader must be generous to his followers but firm when necessary. That a leader must think not just about today's battle but about tomorrow's security. Osman also received an education in religion and culture. The Turkish tribes were relatively recent converts to Islam, having adopted the faith over the previous few centuries. But by Osman's time, Islam was deeply embedded in Turkish identity. Osman would have learned the Quran, learned the prayers, learned the stories of the Prophet Muhammad and the early caliphs. He would have been taught that fighting against the Christians was not just warfare but jihad, holy struggle in the path of God. This gave warfare meaning beyond mere plunder. It made conquest a religious duty. This ideology would become central to Ottoman identity and would justify centuries of expansion. But Osman's education was not just religious and military. He also learned from the wise men of his time, particularly from one man who would have an enormous influence on his life, Sheikh Edebali. Edebali was a Sufi holy man, a mystic, a scholar, someone who had spent years studying the deeper meanings of Islam. He had a small lodge near Osman's territory where he taught students and welcomed travelers. Sufi sheikhs like Edebali were enormously influential on the frontier. They provided spiritual guidance, they mediated disputes, they gave legitimacy to rulers. A beylik that had the support of a respected sheikh was stronger than one that did not. Ertugrul understood this, and he cultivated a relationship with Edebali. He sent his son Osman to study with the sheikh, to learn not just warfare but wisdom. And Osman, as a young man in his late teens or early 20s, spent time in Edebali's lodge. He learned about Islamic law and theology. He learned about the mystical path to God that the Sufis taught. He learned about justice and governance. And he met Edebali's daughter. Her name, according to different traditions, was either Malhan Hatun or Bala Hatun. The sources disagree, reflecting the fact that we are dealing with events from 7.5 centuries ago, events that were not well documented at the time. But what matters is this: Osman fell in love with Edebali's daughter. And this love would become intertwined with his destiny and with the prophetic dream that would define his life. According to the later Ottoman traditions, Edebali was not initially pleased with the idea of his daughter marrying a frontier warrior. Osman might be the son of a bey, but he was still young, still unproven, still just a tribal chief's son in a dangerous and unstable world. Why would a learned sheikh give his daughter to such a man? But Osman was persistent. He courted her with all the passion of youth. And he proved himself in battle and in wisdom. And then came the night of the dream. Osman, as the story goes, was visiting Edebali's lodge. He had spent the evening in conversation with the sheikh, discussing religion, politics, the state of the world. And then he slept there, as was customary for guests. And in that sleep, he had the dream. The dream of the moon and the tree. The dream that revealed his destiny. He woke in the night, overwhelmed by what he had seen. And in the morning, he told Edebali about the dream. He described how the moon had risen from Edebali's chest and entered his own. How the tree had grown from his body and covered the world. How the rivers had flowed and the cities had risen. How the swords had gleamed like leaves. How the crowns had hung like fruit. How his ring had pointed toward Constantinople. Edebali listened in silence. He was a man who understood symbols, who believed in divine messages, who knew that God sometimes spoke to people through dreams. And as he listened, he realized what this dream meant. This was not just a young man's fantasy. This was a prophecy. God was telling him that Osman was destined for greatness. That from Osman's loins would come rulers who would conquer vast territories. That the dynasty Osman founded would last for centuries and change the world. And if this was God's plan, who was Edebali to stand in the way? According to the tradition, Edebali said to Osman, "My son, congratulations. God has given sovereignty to you and your descendants. My daughter is yours. But remember this. In this world, there will be good and evil. Take care of your people. Do justice. Be generous to strangers. Remember that you rule by God's will, and you must rule according to God's law. And Osman, moved beyond words, accepted the blessing and the responsibility. The marriage was arranged. Edebali's daughter became Osman's wife. And Osman, now with the blessing of the most respected spiritual figure in the region, now with a prophetic dream to guide him, now with a sense of divine mission, began to transform from a tribal warrior into something more. He began to see himself as a state builder, as a dynasty founder, as someone chosen by God for a special purpose. Now, we must pause here and acknowledge something. Is this story true? Did this dream really happen? Did Edebali really interpret it this way? Did Osman really have this mystical experience? The honest answer is, we do not know. The dream story appears in later Ottoman sources, written long after the events, written by court historians who had every reason to glorify the dynasty's origins with miraculous stories. There are no contemporary accounts of the dream. We cannot prove it happened. But we also cannot prove it did not happen. And more importantly, whether the dream happened exactly as described or not, the story tells us something crucial about how Osman and his followers understood their mission. They saw themselves as divinely ordained. They saw their expansion not as mere conquest but as fulfilling God's plan. They saw themselves as builders of a universal Islamic empire. This belief, whether it came from a real dream or was a later creation to justify their success, was enormously powerful. It motivated warriors. It attracted followers. It gave meaning to suffering and sacrifice. So let us continue the story, understanding that we are dealing with history as it was remembered and recorded, which may not be exactly history as it happened, but which reveals the truth of how Osman and his followers saw themselves and their mission. By the early 1280s, Osman was in his mid-20s. His father Ertugrul was growing old. The leadership of the tribe was gradually passing to the younger generation. And Osman, inspired by his dream, blessed by Sheikh Edebali, married and starting a family, began to take a more active role in the tribe's affairs. The world around him was still in chaos. The Mongol Ilkhanate still nominally ruled Anatolia through puppet Seljuk sultans. But Mongol control was weakening. The Ilkhans were distracted by wars in Persia and the Middle East. The Seljuk Sultanate was fragmenting. Different beyliks were becoming increasingly independent, no longer looking to Konya, the Seljuk capital, for direction. This was a time of opportunity for ambitious men. And Osman was ambitious. But his ambition was different from that of many of his contemporaries. Other beys were content to raid, to plunder, to grab what they could while they could. Osman thought longer term. He wanted to build something lasting. He wanted to create not just a beylik but a state. He wanted to fulfill the prophecy of his dream. And so he began to act not like a tribal raider but like a state builder. He started with what he had. A small territory around Soud, a few hundred fighting men, the support of Sheikh Edebali, and a dream of empire. It was not much, but it was enough to start. Osman's first priority was to secure and expand his territory. To the west lay Byzantine lands, wealthy but weakly defended. The Byzantine Empire in the late 13th century was a shadow of its former glory. It had been devastated by the Fourth Crusade in 1204. When Western European crusaders had sacked Constantinople and divided the empire among themselves. Although the Byzantines had recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the empire never fully recovered. It was weakened by civil wars, by economic decline, by the loss of Anatolia to the Turks. The Byzantine presence in northwestern Anatolia was limited to a few fortified cities and some scattered garrisons. The countryside was increasingly controlled by Turkish raiders. For Osman, this was the perfect target. Weak enough to attack successfully, rich enough to be worth taking, close enough to be accessible. But Osman did not just raid randomly. He was strategic. He identified key towns and fortresses that, if captured, would give him control of important routes and resources. He studied Byzantine defenses, looking for weaknesses. He built alliances with other Turkish groups, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through shared military campaigns, sometimes through simple diplomacy. And he began a systematic campaign of expansion. Not rapid conquest, which would have been impossible with his limited forces, but gradual, patient, methodical expansion. Take a village, secure it, integrate it into his territory, then move to the next target. Build alliances with the local population when possible, offering protection in exchange for taxes. Use force when necessary, but always with a clear strategic goal. One of Osman's key innovations was his treatment of conquered populations. Many Turkish raiders simply plundered Christian villages and moved on. Osman took a different approach. When he conquered a Christian village, he offered the inhabitants a choice: convert to Islam and become full members of the Ottoman community with all the rights that entailed, or remain Christian but pay a special tax, the jizya, and accept Ottoman rule. This was in accordance with Islamic law, which granted protected status to Christians and Jews as people of the book. But it was also smart politics. A Christian farmer who was allowed to keep his land and his faith would keep farming, producing food and paying taxes. A terrorized population would flee or rebel. A protected population would be productive. This policy meant that Ottoman-controlled territories were more stable and prosperous than those of many other beyliks. Osman also attracted warriors from other tribes and beyliks. The frontier was full of young men seeking adventure, wealth, and religious merit through fighting against the Christians. Osman, with his growing reputation and his aura of divine favor thanks to the dream story, became a magnet for these Ghazis. They came to fight under his banner, and if they proved themselves, they were rewarded with land, plunder, positions of authority. This created a virtuous cycle. Success attracted more warriors enabled more success. And Osman was careful to reward loyalty and competence, creating a core of followers who were bound to him not just by tribal ties but by shared interest and mutual respect. Around 1280 or 1281, Ertugrul died. The exact date is uncertain, like so much in this early period. But Osman, now in his early to mid-20s, became the bey of the Kai tribe. This was a crucial moment. Would the tribe accept the leadership of this young man? Would rivals challenge him? Would the transition be smooth or violent? In many tribal societies, succession was a time of instability and conflict. But Osman seems to have managed the transition successfully. Perhaps his father had prepared the ground well. Perhaps the blessing of Sheikh Edebali gave him legitimacy. Perhaps his own qualities of leadership were already evident. Whatever the reasons, Osman became bey without significant opposition. And now he was free to pursue his vision without the constraints of deferring to his father. The 1280s and 1290s were decades of steady expansion for Osman. He captured small Byzantine fortresses and towns. He raided deeper into Byzantine territory, bringing back plunder and prestige. He forged alliances with neighboring beyliks when it suited him, and fought them when necessary. He continued his policy of integrating conquered populations rather than simply exploiting them. And his territory grew, slowly but steadily. Contemporary Byzantine sources from this period begin to mention Osman, though only briefly. He was becoming significant enough to notice, though not yet a major threat. The Byzantines were more worried about their conflicts with other powers, with the Genoese and Venetians who controlled much of their trade, with the Serbs who were expanding in the Balkans, with internal political disputes. A minor Turkish bey on their eastern frontier was an annoyance, not a crisis. But some Byzantines saw the danger. They recognized that Osman was different from the typical Turkish raider. He was not just plundering, he was conquering and holding territory. He was building institutions. He was creating something that might become a serious threat. Some Byzantine commanders tried to organize resistance, to drive Osman back before he became too strong. But they were hampered by lack of resources, by the Byzantine Empire's many other problems, by political divisions within the empire. Their efforts to stop Osman were too little, too late. And Osman, patient and strategic, continued his expansion. One of the most important early victories came in 1302 at the Battle of Baphius, near the town of Nicomedia. This was not a huge battle by the standards of the time, perhaps 2,000 Byzantine soldiers against Osman's forces. But it was significant. A Byzantine army had marched to try to stop Osman's raids and to relieve a besieged fortress. Osman met them in open battle. The details of the battle are scarce in the sources, but the outcome is clear. The Byzantines were defeated, routed, driven back. It was a complete victory for Osman. The psychological impact was enormous. Byzantine prestige suffered a major blow. It was demonstrated that Osman could not just raid villages but could defeat regular Byzantine troops in pitched battle. This attracted even more warriors to Osman's banner. It discouraged Byzantine resistance. It marked Osman as a major power in northwestern Anatolia. After Baphius, Osman's expansion accelerated. More Byzantine fortresses fell. More territory came under his control. The region between Soud and the Sea of Marmara, the sea that separates Anatolia from Europe, was increasingly Ottoman. Not fully conquered yet, there were still Byzantine strongholds holding out, but the momentum was clearly with Osman. And Osman began to look toward bigger prizes. He began to look toward Bursa. Bursa was one of the great cities of Bithynia, wealthy from the silk trade, strongly fortified, a major Byzantine center. If Osman could take Bursa, it would be a triumph beyond anything he had yet achieved. It would prove that he was not just a successful raider but a state builder capable of taking and governing major cities. It would provide him with the resources to expand even further. Bursa became Osman's obsession, his great goal, the city that would crown his achievements. But Bursa would not be easy. Its walls were strong. Its garrison was determined. It was supplied from the coast, making a simple siege difficult. Osman tried direct assault and was repulsed. He tried blockade, but the Byzantines maintained supply lines from the sea. Years passed. Osman captured other cities, conquered other territories, but Bursa held out. And as the years passed, Osman was getting older. He was now in his 50s, then his 60s. He had spent his entire adult life at war, expanding his beylik, building his state. He had achieved extraordinary things. He had transformed a small frontier tribe into a significant regional power. He controlled a large swath of northwestern Anatolia. He commanded thousands of warriors. He was respected and feared. But Bursa still stood. And Bursa had become more than just a strategic objective. It had become a symbol, a test, a challenge that he had to overcome to prove that his dream was real. Around 1299, Osman made a decision that would define his legacy and formalize what he had been building. He declared independence from the Seljuk Sultanate. This was a bold move, a formal announcement that he was no longer a vassal, that he was a sovereign ruler in his own right. He ordered coins minted in his own name, a crucial symbol of sovereignty in the medieval world. He had his name mentioned in the Friday prayers, the khutbah, another key marker of independent rule. He established formal court ceremonies. He began to use the title of sultan, or at least emir, depending on the source. This was the formal birth of the Ottoman state. No longer just a beylik, a tribal principality, but an independent sultanate with aspirations to permanence and expansion. Why 1299? The sources disagree on the exact date, and some modern historians question whether there was a single moment of declaration or a more gradual process. But the traditional date is 1299, and it has symbolic power. It marks the point at which Osman was saying to the world, I am not just a tribal chief. I am not just a successful raider. I am a sovereign ruler. I am building a state that will last. And I am founding a dynasty. This was the fulfillment of the prophetic dream. The tree was beginning to grow. And Osman, now in his 40s, was seeing his vision start to become reality. But he also knew that true legitimacy would come not just from declarations but from accomplishments. And the great accomplishment that still eluded him was Bursa. Osman intensified his efforts against Bursa. He laid siege to the city, cutting off its land routes. He raided the surrounding countryside, destroying crops and villages to prevent the city from being resupplied from its hinterland. He built fortresses around Bursa to maintain the siege even when he had to attend to other matters elsewhere. He negotiated with the Byzantines, offering terms, trying to convince them that surrender was inevitable. But the Byzantines in Bursa, whether from loyalty or stubbornness or hope that relief would come from Constantinople, refused to surrender. Year after year, the siege continued. And year after year, Osman grew older. His hair turned gray. His body, battered by decades of warfare, began to fail him. According to later sources, he developed gout, a painful condition that made movement difficult. He could no longer personally lead raids as he had in his youth. He relied more on his sons and commanders. Osman had several sons, but the most capable was Orhan. Orhan had grown up in the shadow of his father's achievements, had been trained from childhood to continue the family mission, had fought in his father's campaigns and proven himself brave and intelligent. Osman began to prepare Orhan for the succession, involving him in decisions, giving him command of military operations, teaching him the arts of governance. The relationship between Osman and Orhan seems to have been good, without the rivalry and conflict that poisoned many medieval father-son relationships. Osman trusted his son. Orhan respected his father. They worked together toward the common goal, the expansion and consolidation of the Ottoman state. By the early 1320s, Osman was in his 60s, old by medieval standards, especially for a man who had spent his life fighting. His health was failing, but Bursa still stood. It must have been enormously frustrating. He had achieved so much, conquered so much territory, built such a powerful state. But this one city, this symbol, this prize, still eluded him. He knew he was running out of time. He knew that he might not live to see Bursa fall. And so he called Orhan to his bedside and gave him his final instructions. The exact words are not recorded by contemporary sources, but later Ottoman historians preserved what they said were Osman's deathbed words to his son. "My son," Osman said according to these accounts, "I am dying. But the work is not finished. Bursa must be taken. It must become our capital, the seat of our power. Promise me that you will not rest until you have taken that city. Promise me that you will continue to expand our state, to fight for the faith, to build something that will last. And remember this. Be just to your subjects, Muslim and Christian alike. Reward those who serve you well. Punish those who betray you. Keep your word. Protect the weak. Be generous to the poor. Honor the scholars and the holy men. And never forget that our power comes from God, and we must rule according to His law. Do this, and our dynasty will endure. Fail in this, and everything we have built will crumble." Orhan, weeping according to the accounts, promised his father that he would fulfill these instructions. He would take Bursa. He would continue the expansion. He would be a just and wise ruler. He would honor his father's legacy. Osman, satisfied, closed his eyes. The year was 1323 or 1324, the exact date uncertain. He was approximately 65 years old, having ruled for over 40 years since his father's death. He had taken a small frontier tribe and transformed it into a significant state. He had conquered a large territory. He had established administrative and military systems that would outlast him. He had founded a dynasty that would rule for 6 centuries. He had seen the beginnings of the fulfillment of his prophetic dream. But he died without entering Bursa as a conqueror. That triumph would belong to his son. Bursa would fall in 1326, 2 or 3 years after Osman's death. Orhan would make it the capital, just as his father had commanded. And Osman's remains would later be brought to Bursa and buried there in a tomb that still stands today, a monument to the founder of the dynasty. So ended the life of Osman. But his story does not end with his death. His legacy would shape centuries of history. Let us step back and consider what Osman accomplished and how he did it. He started with almost nothing. A small tribe, a dangerous frontier territory, a world in chaos. He ended having founded a state that would become an empire. How did he do it? What were the keys to his success? First, vision. Osman saw possibilities that others did not see. While other beys were content to raid and plunder, Osman thought about building a state. While others focused on immediate gains, Osman planned for the long term. The prophetic dream, whether literally true or metaphorically true, captured this vision. Osman believed he was building something that would last, something that would grow, something that would eventually encompass the world. This vision inspired him and inspired his followers. Second, strategy. Osman was not just a brave warrior, though he was that. He was a strategic thinker. He carefully chose his targets, focusing on Byzantine territories that were wealthy but weakly defended. He built alliances when useful and fought when necessary. He did not overextend his forces. He consolidated each conquest before moving to the next. He understood that rapid expansion without solid foundations leads to collapse. Better to grow slowly but surely than to grab everything and lose it all. Third, tolerance and integration. Osman's policy toward conquered Christian populations was crucial. By allowing them to keep their faith and property in exchange for taxes and loyalty, he created stable territories. This was not just morally preferable to the alternative of massacre and forced conversion, though it may have been that too. It was pragmatically superior. Stable territories generated revenue. Productive populations created wealth. This wealth funded further expansion. It was a virtuous cycle. Fourth, meritocracy. Osman rewarded competence and loyalty regardless of tribal origin. Warriors who proved themselves were given positions of authority even if they came from other tribes or beyliks. This attracted talented individuals to his service and created a core of skilled administrators and commanders. Fifth, religious legitimacy. Osman cultivated relationships with religious scholars and Sufi sheikhs like Edebali. Their support gave him legitimacy in the eyes of his Muslim subjects and followers. The ideology of Gaza, of holy war against the Christians, motivated his warriors and justified expansion. This was not cynical manipulation. Osman seems to have been genuinely pious. But it was also good politics. Sixth, family solidarity. The relationship between Osman and his son Orhan was crucial. There was no succession conflict, no civil war when Osman died. Orhan had been prepared for leadership and stepped into his father's role smoothly. This continuity allowed the Ottoman state to continue expanding without the interruption that succession crises caused in many other dynasties. Seventh, patience. Osman did not expect instant results. He was willing to besiege Bursa for years, to expand his territory slowly, to build institutions gradually. He understood that great achievements take time. This patience, combined with persistent effort, eventually yielded extraordinary results. These qualities, vision, strategy, tolerance, meritocracy, religious legitimacy, family solidarity, and patience, were the foundations of Ottoman success. Osman did not invent all of these principles. Many were drawn from Islamic political tradition and from the practices of earlier Turkish states. But he combined them effectively and passed them on to his successors. These would become the hallmarks of Ottoman statecraft for centuries. Now let us consider Osman's legacy in more concrete terms. What exactly did he leave to his son and his dynasty? First, territory. Osman transformed a small tribal area around Soğut into a substantial state controlling much of northwestern Anatolia. This territory provided resources, manpower, and a base for further expansion. Second, a trained and loyal military force. Osman's warriors were experienced, disciplined, and motivated. They had learned to fight together effectively. They had a tradition of victory. They believed in their cause. This military force would be the instrument of Ottoman expansion for decades to come. Third, administrative systems. Osman began the process of creating institutions for governance, tax collection, justice, military organization. These were still rudimentary compared to what they would become, but the foundations were laid. Fourth, a ruling ideology. The combination of Islamic holy war, Turkish tribal traditions, and the vision of universal empire gave the Ottomans a sense of purpose and direction. This ideology would motivate and justify expansion for centuries. Fifth, alliances and diplomatic relationships. Osman had established relationships with religious leaders, with other beyliks, with segments of the Byzantine population. These relationships provided information, support, and opportunities. Sixth, a reputation. By the time of Osman's death, the Ottomans were known as formidable warriors, just rulers, and a rising power. This reputation attracted followers and intimidated enemies. Seventh, and perhaps most importantly, a dynasty with a sense of destiny. Osman's sons and grandsons believed they were fulfilling a divine mission. They believed their dynasty was destined to rule. This belief gave them confidence and determination through difficulties that might have broken others. Orhan would take these gifts from his father and build on them spectacularly. He would capture Bursa and make it a magnificent capital. He would conquer even more territory. He would create the administrative systems that would govern the empire for centuries. He would establish the first Ottoman presence in Europe, opening the door to the conquests that would make the Ottomans a European as well as an Asian power. Orhan's son Murad would conquer deep into the Balkans, defeating Serbs and Bulgarians, establishing Ottoman control over southeastern Europe. Murad's son Bayezid would bring the Ottomans to the brink of conquering Constantinople itself, only to be stopped by the catastrophic invasion of Tamerlane. But the dynasty would survive even that disaster and come back stronger. Bayezid's great-grandson Mehmed II would finally accomplish what Osman could only dream of, the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire after more than 1,000 years of existence. Mehmed's descendant Suleiman the Magnificent would bring the Ottoman Empire to its greatest extent, ruling territories from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq, threatening Vienna itself, dominating the Mediterranean. For nearly 400 years after Osman's death, the Ottoman Empire would be one of the world's great powers, feared and respected across 3 continents. And all of this traced back to one man, one small tribe, one prophetic dream, one vision of what could be built on the frontier of two civilizations. Let us return to that dream one more time, because it is the key to understanding Osman and his legacy. The dream of the tree growing from his body and covering the world. Whether Osman actually had this dream or whether it was created later to explain his success does not ultimately matter. What matters is that it captured a truth about Osman and about what he created. He planted a seed, not just through his biological descendants, though they were important, but through the institutions, traditions, and vision he established. That seed grew into a mighty tree. The Ottoman Empire at its height did indeed shade vast territories. Its branches did reach over mountains and rivers. Cities did rise under its protection. And Constantinople, the city indicated by the ring in Osman's dream, did eventually fall to his descendants. The swords that were leaves on the tree in the dream represented the military might that conquered and held this vast empire. The crowns that hung like fruit represented the many territories and peoples that came under Ottoman rule. The four great rivers, Tigris, Euphrates, Nile, and Danube, all eventually flowed through Ottoman territories. The dream was prophecy, not in the sense of predicting specific events, but in the sense of capturing the essence of what Osman would create and what his descendants would achieve. It was a vision of empire, of expansion, of building something that would endure and grow and eventually encompass much of the known world. And Osman, whether he had this dream in literal fact or in imaginative vision, dedicated his life to making it real. Consider the span of time. Osman founded his dynasty around 1299. The Ottoman Empire finally ended in 1922, when the last sultan was deposed in the aftermath of World War I, that is 623 years. 23 generations. Through all that time, Osman's descendants ruled. Through all that time, the institutions he began to create continued to function and evolve. Through all that time, the vision he articulated continued to inspire and direct Ottoman policy. This is an almost unparalleled achievement in human history. Most dynasties last a few generations. Most empires fragment within a century or two. But the Ottomans endured for more than 6 centuries, and it all began with Osman. Of course, the Ottoman Empire changed enormously over those 6 centuries. The small Ghazi Beylik of Osman's time bore little resemblance to the vast bureaucratic empire of Suleiman's time, which in turn was different from the struggling empire of the 19th century trying to modernize and survive in a world dominated by European powers. But there was continuity through all these changes. The dynasty remained Osman's. The ideology of expansion and Islamic rule remained, even when it could no longer be practically pursued. The administrative traditions evolved but maintained connections to their origins. The Ottoman Empire was always, in some sense, Osman's empire, the fulfillment of his vision even as it grew far beyond anything he could have imagined. Let us also consider Osman as a person, beyond his political and military achievements. What kind of man was he? The sources give us only glimpses, filtered through centuries of myth-making and hagiography. But something seemed clear. He was intelligent, certainly. His strategic decisions show a mind that could analyze situations, identify opportunities, and plan effectively. He was brave, as all successful frontier leaders had to be. He was patient, willing to pursue goals over years and decades. He was flexible, able to adapt tactics and policies to changing circumstances. He was charismatic, able to inspire loyalty and attract followers. He was pious, genuinely committed to Islam and to the ideology of holy war, not just using religion cynically for political purposes. He was also, it seems, capable of both cruelty and mercy, as was typical of medieval rulers. He could be ruthless toward enemies when necessary. But he also showed clemency to those who surrendered, and he protected populations that submitted to his rule. He valued learning and culture, cultivating relationships with scholars and supporting religious institutions. He was a family man, maintaining good relationships with his wives and children, particularly with his son and heir Orhan. He was, in short, a complete medieval ruler, warrior, administrator, religious leader, family patriarch, visionary. Not perfect, certainly. He made mistakes and faced failures. But he had the qualities necessary to succeed in the brutal, competitive world of medieval Anatolia, and to build something that would outlast him. One final aspect of Osman's story deserves attention: his relationship with the Byzantine Empire. This was not simply a story of Muslim versus Christian, though that religious dimension was certainly present. It was also a story of a new power arising from the ruins of an old order. The Byzantine Empire in Osman's time was ancient, with a history stretching back more than 1,000 years to the Roman Empire from which it descended. It had been one of the world's great civilizations, preserving classical learning, developing magnificent art and architecture, defending Christendom against centuries of attacks from Persians, Arabs, and Turks. But by Osman's time, it was exhausted, weakened by internal conflicts and external pressures, unable to defend its territories effectively. Osman was, in a sense, a grave digger for this ancient empire. Not the one who killed it, that would take more than a century after his death. But one who began the process, chipping away at Byzantine territory in Anatolia, demonstrating that the empire could no longer defend itself, starting the Ottoman expansion that would eventually swallow the Byzantine state entirely. There is something both tragic and inevitable about this. The Byzantine Empire, for all its glories, had lost the vitality necessary to survive in a changing world. The Ottomans, rough and new, had that vitality in abundance. The old was giving way to the new, as has happened countless times in history. But the old did not go quietly. Byzantine resistance, though ultimately futile, was real. Byzantine culture and administrative traditions would be absorbed by the Ottomans and influence their empire. In a sense, the Ottoman Empire became the heir to Byzantium as well as its destroyer, preserving and continuing some Byzantine traditions even as it replaced Byzantine power. Now, as we approach the end of this 6-hour journey through Osman's life and legacy, let us return to where we began. A young man in a tent, having a dream that would change the world. We have followed Osman from his birth and chaos through his rise to power, through his conquests and state building, through his final years of frustrated ambition to take Bursa, through his death and the legacy he left behind. We have seen how a small frontier tribe became the foundation of an empire. We have seen how one man's vision shaped centuries of history. We have seen how empires are truly built, not in moments of dramatic triumph, but through years of patient effort, through vision combined with strategy, through the creation of institutions that outlast their founders. Osman's story is, in many ways, the ultimate success story. Starting from almost nothing, he built something that would endure for more than 6 centuries and at its height would be one of the world's great powers. But it is also a story of unfulfilled dreams. Osman died without seeing Bursa fall. He died without knowing that his descendants would conquer Constantinople. He died without seeing the full extent of what he had started. In that sense, he was like all great founders and visionaries. They plant seeds but do not live to see the full flowering of the tree. They lay foundations but do not live in the completed building. They start journeys but do not reach the final destination. But this does not diminish their achievement. In fact, it makes it greater. To create something that continues and grows after you are gone, to inspire generations unborn, to set in motion forces that will shape the world long after your death, this is true greatness. Osman did this. He created not just a state but a dynasty, not just a dynasty but a tradition, not just a tradition but a vision that would animate an empire for centuries. When Mehmed II finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, nearly 130 years after Osman's death, he was fulfilling Osman's dream. When Suleiman the Magnificent ruled over a vast empire spanning 3 continents in the 16th century, he was building on Osman's foundations. When the Ottoman Empire finally fell in the early 20th century, bringing an end to more than 600 years of Ottoman rule, it was Osman's dynasty that was ending. The tree that grew from Osman's seed had finally fallen. But what a tree it had been! How vast its shade! How many millions had lived under its branches! How profoundly it had shaped the world! Today, more than 700 years after Osman's birth, his name is still remembered. The modern Republic of Turkey, which arose from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, honors him as a founding father. Historians study his life and legacy. His tomb in Bursa is a site of pilgrimage and respect. The empire he founded, though long gone, left a lasting impact on the Middle East, the Balkans, North Africa, and beyond. Borders drawn by Ottoman expansion and retreat still shape our modern world. Cities built or beautified by Ottoman rulers still stand. Traditions and institutions that trace back to Ottoman times still influence how people live and govern themselves. This is Osman's legacy, still alive, still shaping the world, 7 centuries after his death. In the end, what should we remember about Osman? Perhaps this. He was a man who dared to dream big, who had the vision to see possibilities that others missed, who had the skill to turn vision into reality, who had the patience to build for the long term, and who had the wisdom to create institutions and traditions that would outlast him. He was a warrior when he needed to be, a diplomat when that served better, a state builder always. He transformed chaos into order, weakness into strength, a small tribe into an empire's foundation. He did not live to see the full flowering of what he created, but he knew he was building something great. And he was right. The tree did grow. The empire did expand. The dynasty did endure. The dream became reality. This is the story of Osman, founder of the Ottoman dynasty, the man who stood on the frontier between 2 worlds and created a third that would last for 6 centuries. A man who proves that one person, with vision and determination and skill, can indeed change the course of history. A man who started with nothing but a dream and built an empire. This is how dynasties are born. This is how empires begin. Not with thunder and lightning, but with one man, one vision, one dream of a tree that will cover the world. And sometimes, if the vision is strong enough and the dreamer determined enough, the dream comes true. Osman's did. And the world has never been quite the same since.